The letter arrived at the Wilcox house on a Tuesday morning in October of 1882, and Sallie read it twice before she understood that her entire life was about to change in a way she had never asked for and could not refuse. Her Aunt Dorothea had been corresponding with a man named Albert Keller for 2 years. 2 full years of letters traveling back and forth across the country, from the rolling farmland of western Kansas all the way to the cramped row house in Cincinnati, Ohio, where Sallie had lived with her aunt since the age of 16, following the death of her parents from typhoid fever. The letters had come regularly, once a month at least, sometimes twice, and Dorothea had read pieces of them aloud at the supper table with a particular kind of softness in her voice that Sallie had never heard her aunt use about anything else. He was a rancher, Dorothea had explained. A good man. A serious man. He had built something real out of hard ground, and he was looking for a woman of sense and steady character to share it with him. Sallie had thought it was romantic, in the distant way that other people's lives could be romantic when you were not the one living them. She had not thought, not once, not in any of the quiet evenings when she sat near the lamp darning stockings and listening to her aunt hum over those letters, that the story could possibly become her own. But Dorothea had fallen ill in September, a deep rattling illness that settled in her chest and refused to leave. And by the first week of October the doctor had come 3 times and spoken in low, serious tones in the hallway. Dorothea could not travel. She would not be able to travel for months, if ever again. And she had already written to Albert Keller. She had already told him she was coming. The letter that arrived that Tuesday morning was his reply. Short, clean, and utterly without decoration. It said, "I have made arrangements. I will meet the westbound train at Dodge City on November the 3rd. Come in, 2 words. As if the whole of Kansas was a house with an open door and he was simply standing at the threshold waiting. Sallie had stood in the kitchen with the letter in her hand and looked at her aunt lying pale and breathless in the back bedroom, and Dorothea had looked back at her with eyes that were terribly clear for a sick woman. Too clear. The kind of clear that comes when a person has already made a decision and is only waiting for the other person to catch up. "I cannot go," Dorothea said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "But you could." Sallie had been 23 years old that October, and she was not the kind of woman who made decisions without thinking them through. She was careful with money and careful with words and careful with her emotions, and she had learned to be careful because she had lost everything once already and knew exactly how much it cost. But she also knew, standing in that dim bedroom with the smell of camphor in the air and the sound of her aunt's labored breathing, that she did not have the luxury of deliberating for long. "He expects Dorothea Wilcox," Sallie said. "He expects a woman of good character," her aunt replied. "He has never met me in person, 2 years of letters and not a single visit. The distance was too great and the expense too high, and we both knew it. He knows my words. He knows my mind. He knows I am sensible and capable and willing to work." Dorothea paused to breathe carefully as if rationing the air. "All of those things are true of you as well, Sallie, truer even. That is not the same as being the woman he wrote to." "No," Dorothea agreed. "It is not. But I have written him a letter explaining the situation, and I have asked him to receive you in my place and judge for himself. The letter will arrive before you do if you leave soon enough." Sallie had stared at her aunt for a long moment. "And if he refuses me, then you take the train home," Dorothea said simply. "But I do not think he will." The thing was that Dorothea had always been right about people. It was one of her most infuriating and most valuable qualities, this ability to look at a person and understand the shape of them. She had looked at Albert Keller's letters for 2 years, and she had decided something about him, that she trusted enough to send her niece 2,000 miles in her own place. Sallie had folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope. She had gone to her room and sat on the edge of her narrow bed and looked at the 4 familiar walls for a long time. She had thought about her life in Cincinnati, which was decent and quiet and entirely without surprise. She had thought about the small amount of money she had saved, which would keep her for perhaps 3 months if she was careful. She had thought about the vast plains of Kansas that she had never seen, but had heard described in Albert Keller's letters, which Dorothea had sometimes read aloud over supper. He had described a land of enormous sky and difficult beauty, where the grass ran for miles and the wind was a constant companion, and the work was hard but the horizon was something you could believe in. She had packed 2 trunks and bought a train ticket for October 29th. She had arranged for a neighbor woman to check on Dorothea twice a day. She had written a careful, honest letter of her own and sent it ahead, addressed to Mr. Albert Keller, Dodge City, Kansas, explaining everything. Her name was Sallie, not Dorothea. She was the niece, not the aunt. She was 23 years old, and she had read every letter he had ever sent to her aunt, and she understood, or believed she understood, the kind of man he was, and she hoped he would not turn her away without at least the grace of a conversation. She had sealed that letter and mailed it, and then done her best not to think about what might be waiting for her at the other end of the line. The train journey west was 5 days of dust and noise and wonder. Sallie had never been farther west than Indiana, and the way the land changed as the miles accumulated was something she had not anticipated. The gradual flattening of the earth, the widening of the sky, the way the trees thinned and then nearly disappeared until the world became a thing of pure horizontal space that seemed to go on without end or apology. She sat at the window for hours at a time and watched it, this country that asked nothing and offered everything, this emptiness that was somehow not empty at all but full of a particular quality of light that she had no word for. She arrived in Dodge City on November 3rd, 1882, on a cold, clear afternoon, and the first thing she noticed was the wind. It came off the plains with an authority that was almost personal, pressing against her as she descended from the train car with her hat gripped in one hand and her small traveling bag in the other, as if the land itself was asking her a question and waiting to see how she answered. Dodge City in 1882 was not the lawless place it had been in the height of the cattle drive years. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad had brought order along with commerce, and while there were still saloons enough and a certain hardness to the light off the unpainted buildings, it was also a working town, a town with a post office and a dry goods store, and a church with a white wooden steeple that caught the afternoon sun. Sallie stood on the platform with her 2 trunks and looked at the crowd of people meeting the train and tried to identify a man who might be Albert Keller. She had no idea what he looked like. It occurred to her now with a cold little shock that she had never thought to ask. Dorothea had never described him physically in any of the passages she had read aloud, or if she had, Sallie had not paid that kind of attention. The crowd thinned slowly. Families reunited and moved away. Men collected freight. A young woman was met by another young woman and they embraced with great noise. And then there were only a handful of people left on the platform, and among them, standing slightly apart from the rest, was a man who was watching her. He was tall. That was the first thing. Tall and broad-shouldered in a dark canvas coat, with the collar turned up against the wind, wearing a hat that had seen hard weather and kept it. He had a face that was lean and direct, sun-darkened in the way of men who worked outdoors without apology for the exposure, with dark eyes that were watching her with an expression she could not immediately name. Not unfriendly, not warm. Somewhere in the particular country between the two, where a man watches something he has been thinking about for a long time and is now in the process of deciding what he actually thinks. He was perhaps 29 or 30, she guessed. Solidly built, with big hands that hung at his sides without fidgeting. He looked like a man who did not fidget. He walked toward her, and she stood her ground, which took more courage than she had expected because the closer he got the more real the situation became, and the realness of it was considerably more overwhelming than the idea had been from Cincinnati. "Miss Wilcox," he said, and his voice was low and careful, the kind of voice a person develops when they are accustomed to saying important things with few words. "I am," she said. "I am Sallie Wilcox. I wrote ahead. I hope the letter arrived." "It arrived," he said. He looked at her steadily. She looked back at him with equal steadiness and was proud of herself for it, because her heart was going at a considerable rate underneath her calm exterior. "I am Albert Keller," he said, which was entirely unnecessary and which somehow made her want to smile, though she contained it. "I know," she said. "I recognized you." One dark eyebrow moved slightly. "How?" "You looked like a man who had been waiting for something he was not entirely sure about," she said, and this time she let herself have the small smile, just the edge of it. He was quiet for a moment. "I got your letter," he said again, and she understood that he was thinking carefully about what came next, turning something over. "You were honest in it. I tried to be. You said you were not the woman I had been writing to, but that you had read all the letters, and that you hoped I would not judge you by the accident of your relation to Miss Dorothea rather than by your own qualities, such as they might be." He had memorized portions of her letter. She filed that away. "That is what I said," she confirmed. "Do you intend to send me back?" Albert Keller looked at her for another long moment, the kind of look that was doing actual work, assessing and reconsidering and arriving somewhere, and then he picked up both of her trunks as if they weighed nothing at all. "I have a wagon outside," he said. "It is a 2-hour drive to the ranch. You look like you could use a hot meal." It was not exactly the romantic welcome that novels described, but there was something in it that felt honest, and Sallie Wilcox had always trusted honest things more than beautiful ones. She fell into step beside him, and they walked off the platform together into the roaring Kansas wind. The wagon was a good solid farm wagon with 2 horses, a bay and a gray, both well cared for in the way that told you something reliable about the man who owned them. Albert helped her up onto the seat with a matter-of-fact courtesy that was neither fussy nor cold, just practical and respectful, and then he climbed up the other side, and they set off down the main street of Dodge City and out onto the open road that led south and west. For the first mile they did not speak. The silence was not uncomfortable exactly, but it was full. The way silence is when 2 people are both thinking hard, and neither one has yet decided where to begin. Sallie spoke first because she was the one who had arrived uninvited, and that meant the burden of beginning was hers. "I want to be direct with you, Mr. Keller." "I prefer it," he said. "My aunt is ill. She may recover, but it will be a long recovery, and she could not come. She sent me because she believed that the qualities she described in her letters were also mine, and because she believed, based on 2 years of correspondence, that you were the kind of man who would be fair about an unexpected situation." She paused. She may have been presuming too much. "I understand that this is strange. You wrote to a woman you had never met, and she has sent someone else in her place, and that is not a small thing." Albert guided the horses around a rut in the road without any apparent urgency. "No," he said, "it is not a small thing." "I'm not asking you to pretend the situation is other than what it is," she continued. "I have enough money to stay at the boarding house in Dodge City for a few weeks while arrangements are made, if that is what you decide. I will not hold you to anything that was intended for my aunt." He was quiet for a moment. A hawk turned in the sky ahead of them, enormous and unhurried. "What are your qualities?" he asked. She blinked. "I beg your pardon." "You said your aunt believed your qualities were as she described in her letters. What are they?" Sallie sat very straight on the wagon seat and thought about the question with genuine care, because it deserved genuine care. "I am practical," she said. "I am not easily frightened, though I am sometimes startled. I can cook well enough to keep a person alive and occasionally to make them grateful. I can manage accounts. I can read and write clearly, and I do not exaggerate. I am not given to complaints, although I may tell you when I think something is wrong." She paused. "I am told I am stubborn. I believe the people who told me that were generally correct." Another silence. Then, "What are you not?" She turned to look at him, and there was something in his profile, something careful and concentrated, that made her think he was asking genuinely, not to catch her. "I am not patient with cruelty," she said. and I am not good at pretending things are fine when they are not." She thought for a moment longer. "And I am not especially suited to loneliness, though I have had a good deal of practice at it." He turned his head then and looked at her directly for just a moment before returning his attention to the road. Something in his expression had shifted, the smallest amount, the way the light shifts on the plains when a cloud moves. "Neither am I," he said quietly. They drove on. The land expanded around them in the golden afternoon light, flat and enormous and oddly peaceful. Sallie watched it and felt something in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time, something that was not quite hope and not quite fear but was somehow both at once. The ranch came into view as the sun was beginning to descend, and what she saw surprised her. She had expected something rougher, more provisional, something that looked like a man's idea of a home rather than an actual one. But Albert Keller's ranch was substantial. Not grand, nothing like the houses she had known in Cincinnati, but solid and real and cared for. A main house of good timber with a covered porch, 2 outbuildings, a large barn, and a corral where several horses moved in the last light. A kitchen garden running along the south side of the house, put to bed for winter but clearly well tended during the growing months. A windmill turning slowly in the constant Kansas wind. "It is yours," he said, and then seemed to hear how that sounded because he added more carefully, "I built it to be shared." She looked at the house for a long moment. "You built well," she said. He helped her down from the wagon and carried her trunks inside. The interior of the house was plain and clean, with a large stone fireplace in the main room and a good iron stove in the kitchen and furniture that was simple but solid. There was a bookshelf with perhaps 30 books on it. There were curtains on the windows, plain muslin, but curtains nonetheless, which told her that someone had imagined a woman in this house before the woman arrived. He showed her to a room at the back of the house, a bedroom with a window that looked out over the plains and a quilt on the bed that was old but beautiful, the kind of quilt that gets passed through families. "My mother made that," he said, noticing her look. "Is she gone?" "Several years now," he said. "My father too." "I have a brother in Missouri, but we do not see each other often," she nodded. "I lost my parents when I was 16. My aunt raised me." "I know," he said. "She told me in one of her letters." He paused. "I did not know until your letter that the niece had read the correspondence." "She used to read parts aloud," Sallie said. "I heard most of it, I think." Something crossed his face, not quite embarrassment but something adjacent to it, the awareness of having been witnessed in his more private communications. "Then you know more about me than I know about you," he said. "Perhaps," she acknowledged. "You can ask me whatever you like. I will answer honestly." He looked at her again with that direct, careful look. "I believe you," he said, and then left her to settle in. He had a ranch hand named Cody Marsh, who was perhaps 40, and wore an expression of permanent amusement at the general condition of the world. Cody was short and quick-moving, with a red beard that he wore without apology, and he appeared in the kitchen doorway the next morning while Sallie was attempting to make sense of the rain, and introduced himself with a handshake that was entirely businesslike. "You are not Miss Dorothea," he said, not accusingly but with the tone of a man who finds the situation interesting. "No," Sallie agreed. "I am her niece. I have the same name but the younger edition." Cody considered this. "You know how to make biscuits?" "Yes." "Then you are already an improvement on the situation," he said pleasantly, and disappeared back outside. And that was apparently the full extent of his adjustment period. Albert had 600 acres of good grazing land and a herd of nearly 300 head of cattle, plus the horses. He ran the operation efficiently, the way a man does when he cannot afford waste, and Sallie spent her first week simply watching and learning the rhythm of the place. She was not the kind of woman who stood on ceremony or waited to be told where she fit. By the third day she had the kitchen organized to her satisfaction, and was cooking 3 meals a day, and had begun, quietly and without announcement, to bring order to the accounts ledger that sat on the desk in the corner of the main room, which had entries going back 18 months, but was organized in a way that only made sense if you had Albert Keller's particular mind, which Sallie did not yet have. She found him at the ledger one evening, frowning at it in the lamplight, and she sat down across the desk from him and said, "I rearranged it. I hope you do not mind. I can explain my system if you need me to." He looked at the ledger for a moment and then at her. "It is cleaner," he said. "It will also show you at a glance where you are losing money in the winter feed cost," she said. "You are paying more than you need to from the Dodge City supplier. There is a man in Pratt who charges less per ton, and the difference over a winter would be considerable." He was looking at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that meant he was revising something in his mind. "You know feed costs," he said. "I know arithmetic, and I know how to read a contract, and I know that a person can save significant money in the running of a household or a business simply by paying attention to the details." She paused. "My aunt taught me to keep accounts when I was 17. I was better at it than she was within a year, and she was not ashamed to say so." "No," Albert said slowly. "I imagine she was not." He turned the ledger back toward himself and looked at it for a while. "I will write to the man in Pratt." "I already drafted the letter," she said, and placed it on the corner of the desk. "You only need to sign it if you agree with the terms." He picked up the letter and read it. Then he looked at her over the top of it with an expression that was very close to a smile, the first real approach toward one she had seen from him. "Miss Wilcox," he said, "you are a remarkable woman." "I'm a practical one," she said, and gathered her sewing and went back to the fireside. But her heart was doing something warm and unruly that she chose, for the moment, to keep to herself. The days fell into a rhythm that was hard but good. Sallie rose early and cooked and managed the house and helped where she could outside, and she discovered that she was not frightened of hard work and not frightened of the land the way she had half expected to be. The plains were vast and occasionally daunting, particularly in the first weeks when the wind drove clouds across the sky at a rate that made the earth itself seem to move. But they were also beautiful in a way she had no prior reference for. The mornings especially, when the light came in long gold lines across the grass, and the sky was the particular deep blue of high autumn, and the whole of the world seemed to be holding a single clear note. She and Albert talked more in the evenings. At first the conversation was cautious and careful, the way conversation is between people who are still mapping each other's edges, but it grew more comfortable with each week, the way warmth grows when you add fuel steadily and do not try to rush it. She found that he had opinions, strong ones, and that he expressed them with a directness that she respected even when she disagreed with him, which happened more often than she would have predicted. They disagreed about the proper way to treat a sick calf, until Albert's way failed, and he tried hers without comment and it worked, and he said nothing but nodded in a way that she took as acknowledgement. They disagreed about whether the territorial government's recent land policies were favorable to the small rancher, with Albert arguing that the government was slowly tilting toward the interests of the large cattle combines and Sallie arguing that there was still room to operate independently if a man was smart about it. That argument lasted 3 evenings and was not fully resolved, but they both enjoyed it more than either was initially willing to admit. He lent her books. She had noticed the bookshelf in the first days and had looked at the titles with a particular kind of pleasure, the pleasure of finding that a man who seemed entirely physical and practical had also been doing the work of reading. He had novels and history and a volume of poetry that she would not have expected, and when she commented on it, he said, with characteristic brevity, that his mother had sent it and he had read it more than once. She read the poetry in the evenings and sometimes read passages aloud, not performing, just sharing the words the way you share something you find genuinely good, and Albert would sit and listen with his eyes on the fire and his expression quiet, and she could feel, in those moments, the distance between them closing by degrees. He was not a man who rushed. She had understood that from the letters, the careful, measured way he had expressed himself even in correspondence, never reaching for more than he meant, never offering what he was not sure he could give. It had made Dorothea feel safe. She had said once, over supper. It made a woman feel that she was not being managed or hurried or sold something. It made a woman feel that if he got to the end of his thinking and decided on something, the decision would be real. Sallie understood that now from the inside, from the strange intimacy of daily life with a person you are still learning. She could feel him thinking about her, the same way she was thinking about him, both of them turning the situation over with the slow seriousness that it deserved. She wrote to Dorothea once a week. The letters she received in return were still a little breathless, still the letters of a woman not fully recovered, but they were also cautiously glad. Dorothea asked questions about the ranch and about Albert and read between the lines of Sallie's careful descriptions with the skill of a woman who knew her niece very well. In one letter she wrote, "You sound, my dear girl, like a woman who has found the thing she did not know she was looking for. I am glad I sent you, even if the way I sent you was not entirely fair. But I think you knew it was right when you got on the train, or you would not have gotten on the train." Sallie read that letter twice and then put it away in her trunk and did not reply to that particular observation, but she thought about it for several days. It was in late November that things shifted. Not dramatically, not with the kind of sudden declaration that novels like to produce, but in the quiet, specific way of real things. They were coming back from Dodge City after a supply run, the wagon loaded with flour and salt and lamp oil, and a new length of rope for the corral. And the temperature had dropped sharply during the afternoon, and the sky had gone a deep pewter gray that meant weather. Albert had his eyes on the horizon, reading the clouds the way a man reads a familiar face, and his expression was focused and still. "It will snow before we get back," he said. Sallie looked at the sky. "How bad? Not dangerous. Early winter snow, but cold." He paused. "Are you cold?" She was, a little, and she said so. And without discussion, he reached back into the wagon and produced a heavy wool blanket that he placed over her lap and legs with a matter-of-fact efficiency that had nothing of performance in it, just a simple practical act of attention. It was the touch of his hand when he tucked the edge of the blanket around her that did it. Not an improper touch, entirely incidental, just the brush of his fingers against her arm through the coat wool, and she felt it go all the way through her like a current in winter water. She looked at him and he looked at her, and there was a moment, just one, in which neither of them looked away, in which the distance that had been carefully maintained for a month became suddenly impossible to justify. Then he turned back to the horses and said, with a slight unevenness in his voice that she noticed and stored carefully, "We will make it before the heavy of it hits." "I think so too," she said, and they drove home in the snow with the blanket over her lap, and his arm occasionally close to hers on the seat, and neither of them saying anything that did not need to be said, and it was the best conversation she had ever had. The snow came down all night, and in the morning the world was white and still, and Sallie stood on the covered porch with a cup of coffee warming her hands and looked out at the plains buried in clean winter light, and Albert came and stood beside her, and they stood there together for several minutes in the particular silence of early snow, when the world is hushed and everything ordinary is made briefly new. "It is beautiful," she said. "Yes," he said, and she had the feeling that he was not looking at the snow. She turned to look at him, and he was looking at her, and his expression was open in a way she had not seen before, all the careful management of it gone for a moment, and what was underneath was something direct and wanting and very earnest. "Miss Wilcox," he said. "Sallie," she said. "I think it is past time for that, Mr. Keller." "Albert," he said, and there was something almost relieved in the way he said it. "Sallie, I want to ask you something. I want to ask you plainly because I do not know another way." She waited. "I have been thinking about you every day since you got off that train," he said. "I have been thinking about what you said in your letter and what you have shown me in 5 weeks, and I want to say that I understand you are not Dorothea, and I understand the situation was not what I agreed to, and I understand that you have every right to say that this is not what you came here for." He paused, and she could see the effort of the words, the way this kind of speaking cost him. "But I would like very much to court you properly, if you would allow it. Not because I am lonely or because you are here and convenient, but because you are one of the most remarkable people I have ever met, and every morning I wake up, and you are in my kitchen, I feel like something in me is working correctly that has not worked correctly in a long time." Sallie looked at him for a moment, her coffee cup warm in her hands and the snow falling gently off the porch roof in small cascades. And she thought about Cincinnati and the narrow room and the decent quiet life that had no surprises in it. And she thought about the train west and the hawk in the sky, and the ledger she had reorganized, and the book of poetry and the blanket tucked around her knees in the early snow. And she thought about 2 years of letters and a woman who had been right about people. "Albert Keller," she said, "I have been hoping you would say something like that for at least 3 weeks." The smile that broke across his face was startling in its completeness, the kind of smile that only happens when a person has been holding themselves against hoping and then finds out they can stop. "3 weeks," he said. "At least," she said, and smiled back at him, and it was warm and real, and it felt like something coming home. They were not hasty people. The courtship was careful and genuine, the way things are when 2 people have already seen each other in the dailiness of real life before the romantic sentiment was named. Albert rode with her over the land in the clear, cold December days and showed her the far corners of the ranch, the creek that ran west of the property line and froze hard in January, the stand of cottonwood trees that marked the northeast boundary, the hill that the cowboys called Lookout on account of its slight elevation above the surrounding plain. He told her the history of the land, how he had come to Kansas in 1876 at the age of 23 with $400 and a set of tools and a ferocious intention, how the first 2 years had nearly broken him, and how the 3rd year had turned, how he had built the house in pieces as the money allowed. She told him about Cincinnati, about her parents, about the quiet house after they were gone, and the way her aunt had filled it with purpose and practicality, about the work she had done at the dry goods counter before she came west. She told him about reading his letters over her aunt's shoulder, which made him laugh, a genuine quiet laugh that she had not heard from him before and immediately wanted to hear again. "You know things about me I have told very few people," he said. "I know that you once lost a calf to coyotes and cried about it," she said, "and that you do not think there is anything weak about crying over something you raised and could not save." He was quiet for a moment. "I would not have said that to very many people. You said it to my aunt. That is how she knew you were worth trusting." He looked out over the frozen creek and then back at her. "And you, did you know I was worth trusting before you came?" "I thought you might be," she said. "I believed it by the end of the 2nd day." "What happened on the 2nd day?" "You gave me the accounts ledger without being asked," she said. "A man who does not trust a woman does not hand her the ledger." He considered this. "I noticed you looking at it," he said, "and I thought she can probably do something useful with that." "That was right," she said. "I have been right about you in most things," he said quietly, "more than I expected to be this early." She looked at him in the clear winter light, his face serious and warm at once, and she thought that this was what trust felt like when it was not forced or performed, just arrived at honestly, the way water finds its level. "So have I," she said. Cody Marsh was a person of remarkably few illusions and a great deal of tact, which in practice meant that he watched the developing situation between Albert and Sallie with visible satisfaction, and commented on it only once in December, when he caught Sallie humming while she was hanging washing in the cold and came to stand in the barn doorway and said, "He is a good man, Miss Wilcox. He has been lonesome a long time, but he did not let it make him bitter." A man who does not let lonesome make him bitter is a man worth the trouble. Sallie had looked at Cody over the frozen laundry and said, "I know that." Cody nodded. "Figured you did," he said, and went back inside. The Christmas of 1882 came to the ranch in the form of a hard freeze and a clear, brilliant sky that turned the plains into something that looked like the inside of a jewel box. Sallie had brought a small collection of things from Cincinnati. Not decorations exactly, but small familiar objects that made a place feel inhabited. A painted tin box, a length of red ribbon, a small carved wooden bird that her mother had kept on the windowsill. She arranged these quietly around the main room and was not sure if Albert would notice or, noticing, would feel the intrusion of her past into his space. He noticed. He came in from the barn one evening and stood in the doorway looking at the room and then looked at her and said, "The bird is nice. Whose was it?" "My mother's," she said. He nodded and sat down by the fire without saying anything further, but he looked at the bird again once during the evening in a way that felt like acknowledgement. And when he wished her good night, he paused at the door of her room and said, "I am glad you brought it." She had to turn away to compose herself after he said that, which was perhaps the most useful thing she had ever had to do. They celebrated Christmas together simply, with a good dinner that Sallie cooked with help from Cody, who turned out to be unexpectedly talented with pastry, and a bottle of wine that Albert had kept in the cellar since October against the occasion. Albert gave her a length of dark green wool from the dry goods store in Dodge City, good quality, more than enough for a proper dress. She gave him new leather gloves that she had ordered by post from a craftsman in Kansas City, whose name she had found in one of Dorothea's supply lists. He pulled them on immediately and flexed his hands and said, "Perfect," with a simplicity that was better than any elaborate gratitude. They sat by the fire that evening with the wind moving around the house and the plains dark and enormous outside, and Sallie said, very quietly, "I am glad I came, Albert." He turned to look at her, and his expression was the most open she had ever seen it, all the careful management of it completely at rest. "So am I," he said, "more than I know how to say." "You do not need to say it in more words than that," she told him. "I understood it." He reached out and took her hand where it lay on the arm of her chair, carefully, the way a person takes something they have been wanting to take for a long time and is determined to do it right. And he held it in his large, warm hand, and they sat that way by the fire for a long time without speaking, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was in January that the trouble came, as trouble in Kansas has a way of doing in winter, arriving on the back of a hard wind and giving you very little time to prepare. A man named Vance Dutton had a large spread east of Albert's and had been, for the past year, steadily moving his cattle onto the western edge of Albert's land during the grazing season, a little at a time, the way a large operation tests a smaller one to see how much it can take. Albert had spoken to Dutton twice and received polite but hollow reassurances both times, and the situation had not resolved. Dutton's operation was backed by Eastern capital, the kind of absentee investment that was eating the Kansas plains in 1882 and 1883, and the men Dutton hired were not precisely outlaws, but were also not men who made careful distinctions between what was theirs and what was not. One of Dutton's men, a heavy-shouldered individual named Roy Fetter, came onto Albert's land in January and tried to run off 20 head of cattle toward Dutton's line, and Cody found him at it, and there was a confrontation. No shots fired, which was fortunate, but Cody had a cut over his eye from where Fetter's companion had introduced a fence post to the conversation, and when Albert saw the blood on Cody's face that evening, his expression went very still and very cold in a way that Sallie had not seen before and did not mistake for calm. She cleaned the cut and bandaged Cody's head while Albert stood by the stove and did not say anything for several minutes, and then he said, with a quietness that was entirely different from his ordinary quiet, "I am going to see the county sheriff in the morning." "I will come with you," Sallie said. He looked at her. "I can read and write clearly, and I do not exaggerate," she said. "You said yourself that you needed a written statement of the property boundary dispute for the county office. I can write it tonight if you give me the deed records." There was a pause, and then the cold stillness in his face softened just slightly. "The records are in the desk," he said. She wrote the statement that night by lamplight, clean and precise and careful, citing the deed records and the specific dates and locations of the trespass, and Albert read it in the morning before they left and said, "This is better than anything I could have written." "It is what you told me," she said. "I only organized it properly." The sheriff, a solid man named Harker who had been keeping order in Ford County for 3 years and had seen enough of the large operator tactics to know them on sight, received them in his office and read Sallie's statement with attention, and then looked up and said, "This is well documented." "My wife prepared it," Albert said, and then seemed to hear himself and looked at Sallie with a slight expression of surprise at his own words, as if the word had arrived before he had formally decided on it. Sallie looked back at him with a steady expression that she was working somewhat hard to maintain. Wife. He had said it with such natural authority, as if it were already true, as if the word had simply described the actual situation of things. She turned back to the sheriff. "There are 3 separate incidents documented," she said, "with the most recent resulting in injury to an employee and the attempted removal of 20 head of cattle that I have itemized by ear tag number on the second page." Sheriff Harker looked at the second page. "Ear tag numbers," he said. "I thought it would help," Sallie said. The sheriff visited Dutton's operation the following week and delivered a formal warning that was backed by the force of documented evidence. And while it did not entirely resolve the long-term problem of Dutton's expansion ambitions, it drew a clear line that Dutton chose not to test again that winter. The dispute, Sallie thought, would need to be addressed more permanently in the spring, but for now the line held, and that was enough. On the way home from the sheriff's office, Albert had been quiet for most of the drive, and Sallie had let him be quiet because she had learned to tell the difference between his thinking silences and his troubled silences, and this was a thinking one. The plains were brilliantly cold, the sky hard blue and the light very clear, and the horses moved steadily through the cold air. "I said, wife," he said finally about 6 miles out from town. "I heard you," she said. "I want to explain that." "I do not require an explanation," she said carefully. "I understood it was reflexive." "It was not," he said. "It was not reflexive. I want to be honest about that. I said it because I have been thinking about asking you for some weeks, and I was afraid of frightening you away, and that word came out before the question did." He paused. "That is not a proper way to ask. I am aware of that." Sallie looked at the road ahead for a moment and then at him. "Then ask properly," she said quietly. He pulled the horses to a stop in the middle of the road, which under other circumstances might have been peculiar, but the road was empty in both directions for as far as the eye could see, which in Kansas was a considerable distance, and there was no one to observe them in the vast cold afternoon. He turned on the seat to face her directly, which was not easy given the dimensions of a wagon seat, and he looked at her with the entirety of his attention, without any of the careful management or the protective quiet that he had used in the beginning. "Sallie Wilcox," he said, "I did not know you 2 months ago. I know that. I know that 2 months is not a long time, and that we came to each other in a peculiar way, and that I am asking you something that is a great deal to ask. But I know you in the ways that matter, the ways that you cannot simulate or perform, the daily ways, the working ways, the ways you are when things are hard and when they are good, and I am certain of you in those ways more than I have been certain of anything in a long time." He paused, and she could see the effort and the earnestness of it both. "I would like to marry you. Not out of convenience and not out of lonesome, and not because you came and I had already arranged my life for a wife, but because you are the person I want to have this life with, all of it. The hard parts and the cold parts, and the parts that will be better than anything I have managed to imagine." The wind moved across the plains around them, and the horses stood patient and warm in the cold air, and Sallie Wilcox looked at the man in front of her and felt the full weight of the moment, which was considerable, and also the full rightness of it, which was more than she had expected to feel about anything in the wild open middle of Kansas in January. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "Yes." Albert, I rode 2,000 miles on a train and showed up in Dodge City without an invitation and reorganized your accounts and helped draft your legal correspondence," she said. "I think it is fairly clear that I have already decided you are the person I want to have this life with. So yes." The smile that crossed his face was wide and genuine and completely unguarded, and she thought, not for the first time, that his smile was the finest thing she had ever seen, and that she intended to be the cause of it as often as possible. He took her face in both his hands, big, careful hands, and kissed her with great tenderness and some thoroughness there in the middle of the empty Kansas road with the winter sky enormous around them. And she kissed him back with everything she had, and the horses stood entirely still as if they understood the gravity of the occasion and had decided to be respectful. They were married in Dodge City in February of 1883, in the small church with the white wooden steeple, by a minister named Reverend Bates who had an enormous beard and a very earnest manner. Cody Marsh stood as witness, wearing a coat that Sallie suspected he had purchased specifically for the occasion, and which fit him imperfectly but with great dignity. The ceremony was simple, and the vows were traditional, and Sallie said hers in a clear, steady voice, and Albert said his in his quiet, deliberate way that made every word sound as if it had been considered separately and chosen on purpose. After the ceremony, Cody shook Albert's hand, and then, unexpectedly, hugged Sallie with great warmth and said, in her ear, "I told him last October that he looked like a man who had got more than he bargained for, and did not yet know if he was glad about it. I told him if he was smart he would find out before she left." Sallie laughed. "What did he say?" "He told me to go check the south fence," Cody said, "which I took to mean I was right." She wrote to Dorothea that afternoon, a long letter that said everything, and in the writing of it felt the full shape of the thing, how she had come to Kansas afraid and hoping, how she had found something she had not known to look for, how the two of them had built something between them that was solid and real and worth the improbable way it had begun. She wrote about Albert's smile and the accounts ledger and the blanket on the cold wagon seat, and the day he had said wife without meaning to, and then said it again, properly and on purpose. She wrote that she was happy in a way she did not have good words for, which was itself a kind of happiness, to have an experience that exceeded the available vocabulary. Dorothea's reply came 3 weeks later, and it was the most feeling letter her aunt had ever written, which for a woman who was not given to sentimentality was quite a thing. She wrote that she was recovering well, that the doctor was cautiously optimistic, that she hoped to be strong enough to travel by late spring, and wanted more than anything to see the ranch and the man who had taken such good care of her niece. She wrote at the very end, in the slightly crooked handwriting that was a remnant of the illness, "I always knew the best letters he wrote were never about me." Sallie read that line several times and then showed it to Albert, who read it and was silent for a moment and then said, with his characteristic honesty, "She was right." "She usually is," Sallie said. "I think," Albert said slowly, "that she knew something about what a woman needed that she did not think she could give you by keeping you in Cincinnati." Sallie thought about that. "She is not a sentimental woman," she said. "She did not send me here as a gift. She sent me here because she was practical about it, because she could not go and I could, and she trusted her own judgment about you." "But the outcome is the same," he said. "Yes," Sallie said, "the outcome is the same." Spring came to the Kansas plains in March with a violence and a beauty that Sallie had not anticipated. The grass that had lain dormant under the winter came back with a speed and determination that seemed almost personal, greening the plains in a matter of weeks, until the world was an enormous rolling carpet of new color under the high blue sky. The cattle grew restless with it, moving more and eating with a focused enthusiasm that was satisfying to watch. Albert spent longer days in the saddle and came home in the evening smelling of horse and grass and spring air, and Sallie thought every evening that she would never tire of this, the specific daily reality of a life that was genuinely hers. The Dutton problem came back in April, as Albert had predicted it would. Dutton's men began moving cattle onto the western boundary again, this time more brazenly, clearly testing whether the winter's formal warning had teeth or only words. Albert rode to Dodge City twice to consult with Sheriff Harker and once to speak with a land attorney, and Sallie contributed to both consultations with her documented records and her clear correspondence. And by May, the matter had been formally submitted to the County Land Commission, which ruled in Albert's favor based on the deed records and the documented incidents. Dutton did not contest the ruling, which Albert found slightly surprising, but Sallie thought she understood it. The eastern capital behind Dutton was looking for easy acquisitions, land that came without the trouble of an organized opposition. Albert's operation, backed by Sallie's meticulous documentation and her willingness to pursue the matter formally and completely, had made itself too much trouble to be worth the effort. The large operators wanted the path of least resistance, and she had made sure Albert's land was not that. Cody said, when the ruling came in, never had a range dispute resolved with paperwork before. I have to say I prefer it to the alternative. Albert looked at Sallie with that quiet, warm look that she had come to understand as his most private expression of regard, the one he did not use for general company. "So do I," he said. Dorothea arrived in June on the westbound train from Cincinnati, thinner than she had been and moving carefully, but upright and bright-eyed, and with all the particular sharpness of intelligence that had been her most defining characteristic since Sallie was a child. She descended from the train in Dodge City in a traveling dress and a sensible hat, and looked around at the plains and the sky and the unpainted buildings with an expression of frank assessment, the way she looked at everything. Albert met her with Sallie at the station, and the three of them stood on the platform in the June morning, and the meeting between Albert and Dorothea was one of the most interesting things Sallie had ever witnessed. Two people who knew each other deeply from 2 years of written words, and were now arranging that knowledge against the physical reality of each other. Dorothea looked at Albert for a long moment. "You are taller than I imagined," she said. "You are exactly as I imagined," he said, and there was something respectful and warm in it that Sallie thought her aunt would appreciate, which she did visibly, a small softening around the eyes. "I owe you an apology," Dorothea said. "Sending my niece in my place without more warning and under circumstances that were not entirely fair to either of you." "She warned me," Albert said. "Her letter arrived before she did." "She did not inherit her honesty from her parents," Dorothea said. "Her mother was a gentle soul but not always direct. Sallie comes by that on her own." "I know it," Albert said. Dorothea looked at them both together, the way she looked at things she had decided something about, and said simply, "Good." Dorothea stayed for 3 weeks and slept in the back bedroom, and recovered what the journey had cost her in slow, steady increments, sitting on the porch in the evenings, and watching the sun go down over the plains, with an expression that Sallie could not quite read, something between contentment and wistfulness, the face of a person looking at a life that is not theirs but might have been. One evening Sallie sat beside her on the porch while Albert was still in the barn, and Dorothea said, "Do you ever think about the strangeness of how you came to be here?" "Sometimes," Sallie said. "Less than I used to. Are you glad?" Sallie looked out at the plains in the last gold light, vast and beautiful and entirely real, and thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I am glad every day," she said. "Not in a way that ignores the hard parts, because there are hard parts. The winter is very hard and the work is constant and the land does not forgive carelessness, but glad in the way that matters, the way that goes all the way down." Dorothea was quiet for a moment. "He is a good man," she said. "I knew it from his letters, but it is different to see it." "I know," Sallie said. "He looks at you as if you are the most sensible decision he ever made," Dorothea said, with a dryness that was also entirely affectionate. "He is a practical man," Sallie said, laughing softly. "I think that is the highest compliment he knows how to pay." "It is a good compliment," Dorothea said, from a practical man. When Dorothea left in late June, heading back to Cincinnati with a trunk of dried prairie flowers that Sallie had collected for her, and a letter to the neighbor woman detailing certain adjustments to her care that Sallie had determined were necessary, Albert stood on the porch and watched the wagon go toward Dodge City and said, "She is a remarkable woman." "Yes," Sallie said. "You are better at arithmetic," he said. Sallie laughed, a real full laugh that surprised her by its completeness, and Albert smiled his wide, unguarded smile at her and put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood together on the porch in the summer morning and watched the wagon until it was just a dot on the long horizon. The summer of 1883 was good. The cattle herd grew, and the grass was thick, and the spring calves came in strong numbers, and Albert's quiet satisfaction in the work was something Sallie found herself partaking of by proximity, the way happiness is contagious when it is genuine. She expanded the kitchen garden, planting more than Dorothea had thought to suggest, and by August they had more vegetables than they needed, and she began putting up preserves in the serious, systematic way that a frontier winter required. She also began to know the land in the way you know a place after a full year of weather, its particular beauty in each season, its requirements and its gifts. She learned which parts of the creek flooded in spring and which stayed clear in drought. She learned the names and dispositions of every horse in the corral, and they learned her in return, which Albert said was always the true test. She learned where the coyotes ran at night, and where the hawks nested in the cottonwoods, and how the sky looked in the hour before a thunderstorm, all gold and green and ominous, with the wind turning around and the horses getting restless. She and Albert rode together often in the summer evenings, long, easy rides over the land that were as much conversation as they were physical exercise. They talked about everything in those rides, the business of the ranch and the news from the territory and the books they were reading and the past, the long, careful excavation of each other's histories that is one of the real intimacies of marriage. He told her things she had not known from the letters, things about his early years in Kansas, and the loneliness of building alone, and the particular grief of his parents' deaths in the same year, one following the other, and how the ranch had been his way of making something real out of that grief. She told him about her parents, about the typhoid summer, about the way an entire life can change in 3 weeks, and what it is like to be 16 and suddenly required to reorganize everything you understand about the world. He listened in the way he listened to everything important, with his full attention and without interruption, and at the end he said, "You were very young to learn that," which was the right thing, not too much and not too little. In September she told him she was expecting their child. They were in the kitchen, the early autumn morning coming through the windows in long light, and she said it simply and directly, because that was how she said everything, and he stood very still for a moment with his coffee cup in his hand, and then put it down on the table, and came to where she was standing by the stove and took her face in both hands and looked at her for a long time with an expression of such profound and private joy that she felt the tears come before she had decided on them. "Are you well?" he asked, which was the first thing he said, and she loved him for it. "I am very well," she said. "I am entirely well and entirely happy." He kissed her forehead and then her cheek, and then held her against his chest, and she could hear his heartbeat, steady and fast, and they stood that way in the morning kitchen, while the autumn light moved across the floor, and the coffee went cold on the table, and neither of them needed to say anything further. She wrote to Dorothea, who wrote back with a joy that was entirely uncharacteristic and entirely wonderful, 3 pages of exclamation and advice, and the announcement that she intended to come back in March and would not be argued with on the subject. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was hard in the way that Kansas winters are specifically hard, with a deep January cold that went on for 3 weeks without relenting, and a February storm that kept them inside for 2 days and tested the provisions she had put up through the autumn. But the house held well, and the stove was good, and Albert had stocked the barn with enough feed that they lost none of the cattle in the worst of it, which he considered something close to a personal achievement. They spent the confined days of the storm close together, reading and talking and playing cards with Cody, who had an unexpected talent for whist and was not above gloating about it. And Sallie thought that there was something good even about the confinement, the enforced intimacy of it, the sense of the house being a held thing against the weather. She felt the baby move for the first time in February, a small, unmistakable flutter that she could not describe except to say it was the most real thing she had ever felt. And she took Albert's hand and placed it against her, and watched his face go through something that had no ordinary name. "Hello," he said softly, to her stomach, which made her laugh, and she put her hand over his where it rested against her, and the storm went on outside, and the lamp burned warm and gold, and the world was entirely contained in that room. Dorothea arrived in March as promised, this time with considerably more energy than her June visit, her recovery apparently thorough, and she and Sallie together prepared the house for the child's arrival with the combined organizational force of 2 Wilcox women, which was considerable. Albert wisely suggested this was going well and rode out to the south pasture for most of it. The baby came in April, a boy, arriving in the manner of first babies, which is to say with more drama and less certainty than anyone would prefer, but in the end with great success. He was born at dawn on the 14th of April, 1884, with the spring light coming in across the plains and Dorothea there, and the doctor from Dodge City and Albert in the hallway making noise that Sallie could hear through the wall, and that she found oddly comforting, the sound of a man who cared very greatly about what was happening. When it was done and the room was quiet and the baby was in her arms, small and perfect and furious at the world in the particular way of new things, Albert came in and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with an expression that was beyond description, and Sallie looked at Albert and thought, not for the first time but more completely than ever before, that she had come to exactly the right place. "James," Albert said, which was his father's name, and Sallie nodded because she had expected this and was glad of it. "James Keller," she said, and looked at the small red face of her son. "Hello, James." Dorothea stood at the foot of the bed with her hands clasped and her eyes very bright and said nothing at all, which was the most eloquent thing Sallie had ever seen her do. Albert looked at Sallie over the baby's head with that open, unguarded expression, the one she had been collecting since November on the snowy porch. "Are you all right?" he asked, which was still always the first thing he asked. "I am the best I have ever been in my entire life," she said honestly. He took her free hand and held it, and they sat together in the April morning, and the plains outside were green and enormous, and the wind moved the grass in long waves all the way to the horizon, and the baby slept between them small and warm and entirely certain of his place in the world. Dorothea stayed through May, long enough to see James settled into the rhythm of the ranch, and to satisfy herself that everything was as it should be. And when she left this time, the parting was easier because it was clearly not a forever goodbye but a see you soon, the kind of parting that acknowledges a permanent relationship between two places. She turned at the wagon and looked at Sallie with eyes that were clear and warm and said, "I sent you west for entirely selfish reasons, you know. I could not go myself, and I wanted someone I loved to have the life I had decided on." Sallie looked at her aunt with the full knowledge of that which she had understood for some time but not said aloud. "I know," she said. "And I was right about him," Dorothea said, not humbly. "You were perfectly right about him," Sallie confirmed. Dorothea nodded once, with satisfaction. "Write to me every week," she said, and climbed into the wagon, and Cody drove her to Dodge City while Albert stood beside Sallie on the porch with James in his arms, and they watched the wagon shrink into the distance. "She is a force of nature," Albert said. "She has always been," Sallie agreed. "I am grateful for her," he said quietly. "So am I," Sallie said. "Every day." The years that followed were good years, full and real and not without difficulty, because the plains do not permit difficulty to be entirely avoided, but good in the way that a well-built thing is good, because it holds together under weight and use and time. The cattle herd grew to 500 head by 1886, and Albert hired a second ranch hand, a young man from Missouri named Tom Eddy, who was 19 and eager and learned fast. Cody Marsh remained at the ranch with the settled permanence of a man who had found his place and saw no reason to examine it further. The house expanded too. Albert added a new room on the east side in 1885, a proper study for the accounts and correspondence that had grown with the operation, and Sallie occupied it with the seriousness of a woman who understood that the paper business of a ranch was as important as the physical one. She kept the ledgers with meticulous care and managed the correspondence with suppliers and the records of the Land Commission proceedings and the documentation of the cattle register. And the ranch ran with a smooth efficiency that was the product of two people's complementary capabilities. James grew into a sturdy blond boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's willingness to ask questions about everything. He walked at 12 months and talked in full sentences at 2 years, and was by 3 years old a person of considerable opinion and excellent balance on a horse, which Albert took as a personal achievement, and Sallie took as evidence that stubbornness was indeed hereditary. A second child came in 1887, another boy, whom they named Daniel, for no relative in particular but because the name suited him, which became apparent within the first week. Daniel was quieter than James from the very beginning, observant and careful in a way that was already recognizably his own, with a tendency to watch things for long periods before engaging that reminded Sallie, in the best possible way, of his father. She wrote to Dorothea faithfully every week for years, and Dorothea wrote back with equal faithfulness, and the correspondence between them was one of the reliable goods of Sallie's life, the thread that connected her to where she had come from without diminishing where she was. Dorothea came to Kansas every year until 1888, when her health made the journey inadvisable, and after that Sallie took the boys east to Cincinnati on the train once a year, a journey that James found thrilling and Daniel found interesting, and which allowed Sallie to inhabit both parts of herself, the woman she had been before Kansas, and the woman Kansas had made her. Albert never went east with them on those visits, because the ranch required his presence, and because Kansas was where his self was located in some deep and permanent way. But he received Dorothea's letters directly now, his own correspondence with her having evolved into something warm and familial, the letters of a man to a woman he regarded with a particular kind of grateful respect. Dorothea, who had always been right about people, had apparently decided on Albert with the same finality with which she had decided on everything else. She died in 1891, peacefully and at home, which was what she had wanted, and Sallie sat for a long time in the study with the letter in her hands and felt the loss of her in a way that was deep and clean, the way the loss of a person who was entirely themselves feels, not a complicated grief but a complete one. Albert found her there and sat beside her and did not say anything for a while, and then he said, "She was the best kind of person." "Yes," Sallie said. "She was right about nearly everything, and she never made you feel small for not having known it first. She was right about the most important thing," Albert said. Sallie looked at him. "Yes," she said, "she was." He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and the plains outside were enormous and full of autumn light, and she thought of all the letters and all the miles and all the small decisive moments that had carried her from a narrow house in Cincinnati to this room and this man and this life, and she thought that love was like the land in its best aspect, not a single dramatic gesture but a long continuous presence, something that held you reliably across all the seasons. The boys grew. James was a natural with the cattle and took to the work of the ranch with an ease that made the future of the operation clear and settled, which was a quiet satisfaction to Albert that he did not need to state because it was evident in the way he watched his son work. Daniel showed an aptitude for figures that was recognizably his mother's, and by the time he was 12 was keeping subsidiary records with an accuracy that Sallie checked once and then stopped checking because it was unnecessary. In the summer of 1893, when James was 9 and Daniel was 6, and the ranch had grown to 700 acres and nearly 800 head, Albert and Sallie rode out one evening to the hill that Cody called Lookout, the small rise at the northeast corner of the property from which on a clear day you could see the plains for 20 miles. They did this still, these evening rides, the way you maintain the habits that are good and that have served you over time. They sat their horses on the top of the small hill and looked out at the land that was theirs, the long grass moving in the evening wind, the cattle visible as dark shapes on the green, the house and barn below catching the last gold of the sun, the windmill turning in its patient, perpetual way. "Do you remember," Albert said, "what you said to me on the train platform the first day? That I looked like a man who had been waiting for something he was not entirely sure about." "I remember," Sallie said. "You were right," he said. "I had been waiting for something I was not entirely sure about for years, since I built the house maybe. Since I put curtains on the windows and felt foolish about it." She turned to look at him in the evening light, 10 years older now from the man who had stood on the Dodge City platform in his weathered coat, but more fully himself, the way a person becomes more fully themselves as the years pass if they are living honestly. "I have thought about you every day since I read your first letter to my aunt," she said, "which was long before I came here." He looked at her with some surprise. "You never told me that." "I am telling you now," she said. "I used to listen to those letters and think that the person writing them was the kind of person worth knowing, and I was right about that too." "We are a pair of very observant people," he said. "We are," she agreed. "It has served us well." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, the way he had on that first cold evening by the fire, with the same care and the same deliberateness. "I am glad every day," he said, "in the way that goes all the way down." He was quoting her words back to her, from the conversation with Dorothea on the porch that she had not known he had heard, and the fact that he had heard it and kept it and was returning it now was so entirely characteristic of him, the man who said little and meant everything he said, that she felt the full warmth of 10 years come over her at once. "Albert Keller," she said. "Sallie Keller," he said. The sun went down over the Kansas plains, and the sky went from gold to rose to the deep blue of high evening, and they sat together on the hill in the good wind and the particular quiet of a life fully inhabited, a life that had been built honestly from an improbable beginning, and had proved, over time and weather and work and love, to be the most solid and true thing either of them had ever known. They rode home in the dusk with the horses easy beneath them and the house lit warm below. And when they came into the yard, James came running out to meet them with something he had found in the barn that he considered urgent, and Daniel stood in the doorway of the kitchen holding the lamp with his quiet, watchful expression. And the night came in across the plains, bringing with it the smell of grass and cattle and the coming of autumn. And it was entirely good, all of it, in the way that real things are good. Later that night, after the boys were in bed and the house was quiet, Sallie sat at the study desk and took out a fresh piece of paper and began a letter to no one in particular, just a writing down of things, the way she sometimes did when she wanted to know what she actually thought. She wrote, "I was sent west in my aunt's place without enough warning, and I arrived at a man who had been writing to someone else for 2 years, and he said nothing except come in, and I came in, and it turned out to be the truest thing I have ever done." She folded the paper and put it in the drawer where she kept the things that mattered, the things she wanted the boys to find someday when they were old enough to understand what a life was made of, and how it was built, and what it cost, and what it gave back. Albert appeared in the doorway of the study, his hair damp from washing, in his flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled, looking exactly like the man she had been looking at for 10 years, and intended to keep looking at for as many years as the world permitted. "Coming in," he said. 2 words. After everything, still only 2 words when 2 words were enough, because he was a man who did not reach for more than he meant. She blew out the lamp and took his hand, and they walked together through the warm, dark house. And outside, the Kansas wind moved across the plain in its ancient and continuous way, carrying the smell of grass and distance and the long, beautiful nothing of the open country. And inside the house was full and warm and entirely theirs, built carefully over time from letters and a train journey and a snowy porch and a blanket in November, and a man who said come in and a woman who, against all the reasonable odds of the situation, came in and never once regretted it.